Tell me about your best friend, your childhood friend, Nolan.
Nolan was just a guy that if you were feeling down, he was going to put a smile on your face. He always found a way to make me laugh, even though he was getting on my last nerve. But I always love him, man. Like, that guy was, like, he was a blessing. Like, I mean, like, Nolan literally did everything with me. Like, if he wasn't going somewhere, I wasn't going somewhere. If I was going, he was going. Like, we were just, like, we were literally, like, brothers. Like, honestly, like, we did everything. We talked every day. We could be, like, he'll be at college. Obviously, I was still in high school. We'd come back down, still have the same bond. Like, always, we will always have that brotherhood relationship.
What has it been like now in this last week alone?
It's been hard, honestly. Like, it's really stressful. Like, with everything that's been going on, it's just, it doesn't feel real. Like, it just hurts really bad. And I just wish things were differently. Like, it's hard because things don't add up. And I wish I could just, you know, talk to my best friend every day again. And I can't do that anymore. And it just hurts so bad. And I feel like people will just, on the internet, just running with narratives that.
He told me he loved me. Those were the final words Jayvon Williams ever heard from his best friend. Not words that were meant to matter. Not words anyone writes down as important in the moment. Just something you say to someone you care about before you go your separate ways for the night. Except that night never ended the way it was supposed to. Nolan Wells never came home. And for weeks, the story everyone accepted was that he decided to stay behind on that island, that he wanted to. But the person who knew Nolan longer than almost anyone, the friend who watched him grow up, who spent years understanding exactly how he acted with the people he loved, finally sat down and said something that changed the way this entire case is being viewed. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't accuse anyone. He simply said one sentence, calmly, clearly. And it's the kind of sentence that doesn't leave you after you've heard it. Tonight, we're going to go through exactly what he said. Why his father said almost the same thing without ever discussing it with him. And what that means for a case that still, after everything, doesn't have one confirmed answer. Before we get into any of it, I want to tell you something about myself, just once. And then we're going to move past it because this case deserves more attention than my background does. I spent over 20 years handling death investigations for the federal government. I've sat across from parents who didn't yet know their child was gone. I've read autopsy reports that created more questions than they answered. And I've learned one thing that never stops being true. The people who knew the victim best, not the internet, not the loudest voice on a live stream, but the people who spent years standing beside that person in ordinary, forgettable moments, they are almost always the ones who notice when something doesn't make sense. Not because they're investigators, because they knew the pattern. And when two of those people, separately, without planning it, say the exact same thing, that's not noise. That's a signal. So, let's go through this the way it actually happened, piece by piece. And I'll tell you where I stand as we go, but I want you to see the evidence first, because that's the only way any of this music holds together. Horn Island sits about 10 miles off the coast of Mississippi. And if you've never been, it's not what people imagine when they hear beach party. There's no dock, there's no bathroom, there's no road. You get there by boat, you anchor near the shore, and you either wade in or you don't go at all. On the 4th of July, that island fills up with more people than most small towns hold in a day. Some estimates place the number in the thousands. Boats line up 3 and 4 rows deep along the shoreline, engines off, coolers open, music playing from a dozen different directions at once. It is, by every account from everyone who was there, loud, packed, and completely chaotic, in the particular way that holidays on the water always are. Nolan Wells reached that island around 10:30 in the morning with 3 friends on a boat. He was 18 years old, a college football player, the kind of young man his coaches described without hesitation as a pleasure to be around. He had a group chat with his friends the night before, plans already arranged, rides already organized. This wasn't a sudden outing. This was something they'd done before, a tradition, a group of guys who'd known each other since middle school and high school heading out to the same island they'd visited the year before, and the year before that. By all early accounts, the day went the way these days normally go. Drinking, swimming, running into people you know and people you don't. The kind of afternoon where nobody's really watching the clock because there's no reason to. Somewhere during that afternoon, Nolan started talking to a girl he'd just met that day. Her name is Katie McCormick. According to the friends who were with him, he seemed to truly like her. And by the time the afternoon started winding down, he was still with her when his friends were preparing to head back to the mainland. Here is where the story that's been repeated for weeks begins. According to Warren Hudson and the other two friends who were on that boat with him, the vessel began having mechanical problems sometime around 4 o'clock in the afternoon. A pump that's supposed to remove water from the hull had failed. Water was building faster than they could handle it, and they made the decision to head back to shore. According to their account, before they left, someone called out to Nolan to get on the boat, and Nolan told them he wanted to stay behind with Katie, that he'd find a ride back later with someone else. They left at 4:31 in the afternoon. Nolan's phone and his keys remained behind on that boat. He did not. That single detail, that Nolan willingly separated from his phone, from his ride, from the friends he'd arrived with, that detail has remained at the center of every version of this story for over a month now. And for weeks, it went almost completely unchallenged in public because the only people who'd spoken about those final hours were the 3 friends who were on that boat, plus a handful of others who arrived at the island separately. That changed when a young man named Jayvon Williams sat down across from Laura Coates on CNN and said something that put a crack directly through the foundation of that story. Jayvon wasn't some acquaintance offering an opinion from far away. CNN identified him plainly and without qualification as Nolan's best friend. Not a friend from that one summer. Not someone who knew him casually through a shared group.
Miss Christine, how are you and your family holding up?
A lot of praying, a lot of just leaning on each other in this moment and just taking it day by day. That's really all we can do right now. It's been hard. You know, every day is different. And really every second is different, which is something people need to understand. Grief is not one emotion, right? It's multiple emotions and they're all happening at the same time. And so it's just like 1 minute I can be I can be okay like this and I can talk about it. And then the next minute I'm breaking down in tears because it's a constant reminder, because if I'm being honest, we really just have not had time to fully grieve with everything that's going on.
This is your baby, and everyone must understand that. And Jayvon, I want to come to you because, I mean, you're his friend. You were on the island on the 4th. You were on a different boat. Do you recall seeing him at all that day?
Yes, ma'am. I did see him when I was out there on the island.
Can you tell me what you saw? Does anything seem strange to you about the difference that people are saying of how he was separated from the group?
No, ma'am. I don't think that Nolan would say, hey, bro, I'm staying with this girl on the island. Y'all go ahead and go back, without even bringing it, like not even asking to get his phone back. You know what I mean? I don't think that any of that.
What makes you so sure about that? Because, I mean, obviously you've been with him. You've spent a lot of time with him. Did you know him to be someone to leave his phone or even say, you guys go without me?
Never. I've never known Nolan to stay back while his friends leave. He's always been a guy where if he rode with you, he's going to come back with you. That's always how he's been every single time.
You know, this friend of his, Trayston, also told ABC that video people have been talking about that was said to show some sort of altercation, it did not involve Nolan. He says it was actually him yelling in the video and that you and a family member were holding him back because he'd been in a fight. Is that accurate?
Yes, ma'am. We were calming Trayston down. In that video where he said, give me my effing phone back, it sounds like him. So I'm pretty sure that he was right on that. But
Jayvon, I'm so sorry to think about what you must be going through and thinking about what's happened to Nolan. I mean, you mentioned a phone. Tashima, a huge question so many people have is why he would have left his cell phone behind. And you say you were the person who actually went and retrieved that phone for the family. How'd you get your hands on the phone? Where was it?
That is correct. Christine called me and told me, hey, where are the boys? Nolan hasn't been heard from since such and such time. Where are your boys? I said, well, Jayvon is with his girlfriend, and I just spoke with Jalen, and they are headed to downtown, which I was literally getting ready to get in the shower to go downtown as well. She said, well, Nolan has been. So I instantly called with Christine on the phone, Jayvon. Jayvon said no, he hadn't seen Nolan since early on the island. And he was like, what? Are y'all serious? We was like, yes. And so Christine intervened in the conversation and said, Nolan has not been heard from since he left the island. So Jayvon was like, well, that's when I seen it. I haven't seen it since then. Again, everybody goes their separate ways. So I then hang up from Jayvon because obviously there's nothing he can say to tell me anything. So then Jalen, I call him. Jalen did not answer the phone. Christine again is on the phone. Jalen did not answer the phone. LeBaron, he didn't answer the phone. I called LeBaron, which is their other friend, LeBaron Broomfield. He answered. He said, Jalen is in the gas station. Hold on. So he said, hey, Jalen, Mom on the phone. So he was like, Jalen, what's up, Mom? What's going on? I was like, hey, have y'all heard from Nolan? They said, no, we have not heard from Nolan.
But where was the phone?
So I was like, well, okay. So that's when we started checking the phone. Well, for Christine, it said one place, but for them on Snapchat, it showed another place. So that's the place we went to. And it showed that everybody that was in the house, it was like a lot of people there. Like I'm not familiar with all the kids. I only know like one or two there. But it showed that the phone was at what a lot of people were at. So that's how we knew where to go to. We went there. They were all there. They were sitting there, lights off, watching TV.
Did they immediately give you the phone? Because knowing that phone was there.
It took about 15. They did. They gave me the phone, but it took about 15 minutes to get the phone. Because I even asked, I'm like, did y'all have to walk back to Horn Island to get the phone? Or like, where's the phone? Because it took so long when they said it was when Wyatt told me it was in his truck, it took him so long to get the phone back to me.
Christine,
so when they brought the phone back.
I'm sorry, go ahead, Tashima. I want to hear that.
When they brought the phone, after I said something about it, he was like, well, she's going to get it. I was like, who?
Jayvon was actually on Horn Island that same day. And there's one detail about that becomes important. He had originally planned to go out on the same boat as Nolan, but there wasn't enough space. So he ended up taking a different boat instead. The two friends were still on the water that 4th of July, but they weren't traveling together because they'd ended up on separate boats that morning. When Laura Coates asked Jayvon directly if anything about Nolan supposedly staying behind seemed unusual to him, Jayvon didn't pause. He didn't seem uncertain about his answer either. He said, I don't think that Nolan would say, hey bro, I'm staying with this girl on the island. You all go ahead and go back. Without even bringing it. Like, not even asking to get his phone back. You know what I mean? I don't think that any of that. Think about what Jayvon was actually saying there. He wasn't claiming that he saw Nolan make that decision. He wasn't saying he heard a private conversation that nobody else knew about. He wasn't presenting himself as a witness to those final moments. His point was different. He was talking about Nolan's normal behavior, something he believed he had seen consistently throughout their years of friendship. And when Laura Coates asked him why he felt so strongly about it, Jayvon explained that pattern even further. He said he'd never known Nolan to stay behind while his friends left. In Jayvon's experience, if Nolan arrived somewhere with you, especially if he rode there with you, Nolan was going to leave with you. That's how he said Nolan had always been. And that distinction matters. Jayvon wasn't making a prediction about what Nolan might have done that afternoon. He was describing a habit he believed had repeated itself over and over again. According to him, Nolan didn't normally separate from his friends after arriving somewhere together. Now, after more than 2 decades working around death investigations, I've learned that this kind of character information can be important, but it cannot solve a case on its own. People sometimes do things that surprise even the people closest to them. One unusual situation, a new person they meet, emotions, circumstances nobody else knows about, any of those things could cause someone to act differently on a particular day. So, we have to leave room for that possibility. But there was another part of this that caught my attention when I went through what Jayvon said. And I think it's something you should pay attention to as well. Jayvon wasn't the only person who found the idea of Nolan voluntarily staying behind difficult to understand. Nolan's father, Nolan Wells, has expressed almost the same concern. And there's no indication that the two of them worked together on what they were going to say. They were coming from completely different places, yet their conclusions were surprisingly similar. Elmo explained it this way. Behind voluntarily. Why would he stay behind? That we cannot answer. I just can't fathom why he would. I don't know why he would. Then he explained the lesson he had always tried to teach Nolan. He said that if Nolan went somewhere with a group, he was expected to stay with that group. Even after Nolan went away to college, his father said he continued reminding him about the same basic rule. If 5 people went somewhere together, they should come back together. His father remembered telling him, if you go with 5, you come back with 5. Do not separate from the group. I always told him, safety is in numbers. And Nolan's response, according to his father, was always the same. Yes, sir. So, from his father's perspective, Nolan had been taught for years not to separate from the people he went somewhere with. That is why the question remains so difficult for him. If Nolan knew that rule, and if it was something his father had repeated to him throughout his life, why would he suddenly decide to do the opposite on that particular afternoon? His father doesn't claim to know the answer. He simply says, I don't know. Think about what you're actually looking at when you put those two statements side by side. A best friend who knew Nolan for years, who spent time with him at parties, trips, and everyday gatherings. And a father who raised him and repeatedly taught him the same basic lesson about staying with his group. 2 different people. 2 different relationships. But both arriving at almost the same conclusion. Neither one is saying they know exactly what happened on Horn Island. Neither is claiming they witnessed Nolan's final moments. What they're saying is much simpler. The explanation that Nolan willingly chose to stay behind doesn't match the Nolan they knew. And I want to be very clear about something here because this distinction matters. A person's normal behavior, even when described by people who knew them extremely well, is not proof of what happened. 2 people agreeing about someone's character doesn't establish what happened during those final hours. It doesn't tell us who was responsible for anything, and it doesn't prove that Nolan couldn't have made an unusual decision that day. But it does raise a legitimate question. If the explanation being repeated publicly is that Nolan simply decided to remain on the island, yet the people who knew him best say that behavior was completely unlike him, then that explanation deserves to be examined more closely. That's the important part. It's not about declaring one version true and another false. It's about recognizing that there is now an on-the-record contradiction to one of the central assumptions in this case. And that contradiction isn't coming from some random person online. It's coming from 2 people who knew Nolan in very different ways, both saying they cannot understand why he would voluntarily separate from his group. Now, let's return to something else Jayvon mentioned during that same interview. Because there's another detail buried in what he said, and I don't think it's received nearly enough attention. You may have already seen the video if you've been following the Nolan Wells case closely. It's a shaky recording from Horn Island. At first glance, it looks like some kind of heated confrontation. You can hear people shouting. There's movement in the crowd. And in the middle of it, several people appear to be trying to hold someone back. And that video may be more important than it first appears. For some time, a large part of the public believed that video showed Nolan involved in some kind of confrontation shortly before he disappeared. Jayvon was asked about it directly, and this time he was speaking as someone who had actually been there. He explained that he couldn't say for certain who was in the video because of how far away the camera was. But he said the voices were clear enough that, to him, it didn't sound like Nolan. The voice, he believed, matched another friend who had been involved in a separate confrontation on the boat. That friend was Traston. Traston later confirmed to ABC News that the voice heard in the video was his, not Nolan's. He explained that he had been shouting because he wanted his phone back after people pulled him away from a fight. Jayvon supported that explanation. He said he personally saw what was happening and recognized who was involved. And this matters for a reason that goes beyond simply correcting the identity of the person in a video. For weeks, That clip became one of the biggest sources of speculation surrounding Nolan's disappearance. People watched it and tried to connect the confrontation to Nolan's final moments. Some theories were built almost entirely around the assumption that Nolan was the person being heard or seen during that incident. But if Jayvon and Traston are correct, then that assumption was wrong from the beginning. And if two people who were actually there independently describe the same event, that deserves to be taken seriously. It doesn't tell us what happened to Nolan. It doesn't explain where he went. And it certainly doesn't prove what happened during those final hours. What it does is remove one piece of confusion that has been sitting in the middle of this case for weeks. Before you can understand what happened, you have to separate the real evidence from the things that only look convincing because a large number of people have repeated them. Now, there's another detail I think deserves much more attention, and this one comes through Jayvon's own family. His mother, Tashima Hans, has publicly discussed what happened on the night Nolan disappeared, particularly the time she spent with Christine, Nolan's mother, trying to locate his phone. And unlike information that was passed around online, Tashima was directly involved. She described what happened as they were trying to find Nolan's phone that night. According to Tashima, Christine's location tracking app was showing Nolan's phone in one location, while Nolan's Snapchat location appeared to place it somewhere else. Two different systems. Two different locations. And both were being used while a mother was desperately trying to figure out where her missing son's phone had gone. Tashima said she followed the location provided by the tracker and went to the address it indicated. When she got there, the house was dark. She said it took roughly 15 minutes before the phone was finally brought outside and handed over. But what caught attention wasn't simply the amount of time it took. It was what she says she was told during that period. At first, she was reportedly told that Nolan's phone was inside someone's truck. Then the explanation changed. She was told that a girl would be bringing the phone outside instead. Now, I want to be careful with this because a detail like that can easily be made to sound more suspicious than the facts actually allow. A 15-minute delay doesn't prove anything by itself. People were frightened. There was confusion. Multiple teenagers may have been communicating with each other at the same time. Someone could have misunderstood where the phone was. Someone else could have repeated information that wasn't accurate. There are plenty of innocent explanations. But from an investigative standpoint, the part worth noting isn't simply the delay. It's the change in the explanation. First, the phone is supposedly inside a truck. Then, suddenly, someone else is supposedly bringing it out. That doesn't automatically mean something suspicious happened. But it is the kind of inconsistency investigators normally document and then try to explain. They don't decide that it's important because it must mean something, and they don't ignore it because an innocent explanation might exist. They ask questions. Who said the phone was in the truck? Who actually had the phone? Why did the explanation change? Who was communicating with whom? And what happened during those 15 minutes? Those questions don't accuse anyone of anything. They simply make sure that a timeline is complete. As far as the information available publicly indicates, there still hasn't been a detailed public explanation accounting for every part of that 15-minute period. And that's where the issue remains. Now let's step away from the individual witness accounts for a moment and look at the criminal investigation itself, because there has been movement behind the scenes, even though much of it hasn't been made public. The Mississippi State Medical Examiner's Office completed Nolan Wells' official autopsy in late July. The report has been completed. It has been provided to the Jackson County Sheriff's Office. But as of tonight, the contents have not been released publicly. Not to reporters. Not to the general public. And most importantly, Nolan's parents have not been given the report. There's a legal reason for that. Under Mississippi procedure, certain deaths that don't clearly appear to be from natural causes or an obvious non-criminal accident can be presented to a grand jury before the findings are released. The district attorney's office has said investigators and prosecutors cannot release information that could interfere with or compromise that grand jury process. So, this isn't necessarily something created specifically for Nolan's case. It's part of the legal process surrounding deaths that require additional review. But knowing there's a legal explanation doesn't make the situation any easier for Nolan's family. Imagine being a mother who has been searching for answers since the 4th of July and being told that the medical examination has already been completed. The answers exist. The report has been written. But you still can't read it. Not yet. And depending on how long the legal process takes, that could mean waiting months. The grand jury process also carries confidentiality requirements. Those protections can continue for a period of time after the proceedings are finished, meaning that even once the grand jury process ends, portions of what happened may not immediately become available to the public. So while the official state autopsy remains unavailable, there is another examination that the public already knows about. Nolan's family, with the assistance of civil rights attorney Benjamin Crump, arranged for an independent autopsy. That examination was conducted by Dr. Roger Mitchell, a respected forensic pathologist. His preliminary findings were made public in late July. And his conclusion raised another major question. At that stage, both the cause of death and the manner of death were listed as undetermined, pending additional investigation. That's the medical terminology. But here's what that finding actually means. Dr. Mitchell reported an area of red discoloration in the deeper soft tissue beneath the skin at the back of Nolan's head. He described the area as being approximately the size of an open hand. More importantly, he said he could not completely exclude the possibility that non-accidental factors may have played a role in Nolan's death. There was another detail in the independent examination that immediately drew attention. The body examined by Dr. Mitchell did not contain Nolan's neck structures or the tissues surrounding his throat. Those areas can be important when doctors are trying to determine whether drowning occurred, whether there was strangulation, or whether the neck suffered some type of trauma. But those structures were no longer available for the independent examination. They had already been removed and retained by the state's medical examiner before Nolan's body was released for the second autopsy. Now, there's another opinion we have to consider, because if we're going to look at this fairly, we can't only present the interpretation that raises the most questions. Dr. Michael Baden, the former chief medical examiner for New York City and a well-known forensic pathologist, reviewed the findings from the independent examination. His interpretation was very different. Baden said the injury described on the back of Nolan's head could have resulted from something as simple as hitting an object in the water. The water around the island can contain debris, and depending on the circumstances, a person could easily strike something beneath the surface. He also pointed out that the injury described in the report appeared to be relatively superficial and could have occurred either before or after death. Baden went even further. In his assessment, the injury described in the independent report sounded completely innocent. He said there was nothing in those findings, at least at this point, that established foul play. He also criticized the way some of the conclusions from the independent examination were being interpreted, arguing that the evidence didn't support some of the stronger claims being made about what may have happened to Nolan. So where does that leave us? Honestly, it leaves us with uncertainty. And I think it's important to say that clearly instead of choosing whichever interpretation makes the story more dramatic. On one side, you have a highly experienced forensic pathologist saying he cannot rule out the possibility that something non-accidental contributed to Nolan's death. On the other side, you have another highly experienced forensic pathologist looking at the same reported findings and saying they could easily be explained by an ordinary accident. They're working from the same limited information. They're both professionals with extensive experience. And yet they've reached very different interpretations. That tells us something important. This case is not resolved. It's not even close to being resolved. Anyone claiming with complete certainty that they already know exactly what happened to Nolan Wells, regardless of which side they're arguing, is going beyond what the available evidence can actually prove right now. But there's another major development that deserves attention because it adds another layer to the timeline. In early August, the United Cajun Navy released a 22-page report containing information the organization had collected throughout its search for Nolan. This is the same volunteer search group whose pilot first spotted Nolan's body from the air. The report wasn't built around internet rumors or theories. It brought together tips, photographs, screenshots from videos recorded on Horn Island, GPS information, and a timeline the organization had assembled to assist investigators. And one thing about the report stood out to me. The organization was very careful about what it claimed. It didn't present its findings as a solution to the case. Instead, one of its biggest findings was that there is still a hole in the timeline. According to the report, the last period when Nolan could be independently and reliably placed through verified video or corroborated witness information was somewhere between approximately 3:23 and 4:27 in the afternoon. Then there's the boat's reported departure time, 4:31 p.m. That time has been repeated again and again in accounts of what happened that afternoon. But here's the problem. There is apparently no GPS record, engine log, or other electronic evidence that independently confirms that exact departure time. In other words, 4:31 is based on witness recollections and available video, rather than a precise electronic record that establishes the moment beyond question. And that matters, because the moment the boat supposedly left without Nolan is one of the most important points in the entire timeline. Yet that exact moment has never been independently confirmed. The people who were on that boat are the ones who provided the account. According to the United Cajun Navy's report, there isn't enough independently verified evidence to determine whether Nolan was still alive when the boat left. And notice the wording here. That does not mean the report says Nolan wasn't alive. It doesn't mean the boat left earlier than reported. It simply means there isn't reliable evidence that proves either way what Nolan's status was at that exact moment. The report also tracks several boats that moved between different locations along the coast that day. But the organization was careful not to turn those movements into conclusions. It couldn't determine exactly when each movement occurred, who was aboard those vessels at the time, or whether any of those boats had anything to do with Nolan's disappearance. The same caution applies to the mechanical problem that has been part of the Friends' story from the beginning. The report says it cannot establish exactly when the boat began taking on water or what caused that problem in the first place. And the United Cajun Navy itself has been careful not to suggest otherwise. Its leadership has emphasized that the information they collected does not accuse any person or point to a specific explanation. The material was gathered to assist investigators, not to act as a final judgment. That restraint is worth noticing, because over the past month, the internet has been filled with people turning incomplete information into definitive answers. The search organization did something very different. After going through tips, photos, videos, locations, and witness information, it came away with one major unresolved issue. There's still a hole in the timeline. Not a suspect. Not a theory. A missing section of time that hasn't been completely explained. And that becomes even more significant when you consider something Ben Crump has highlighted since the beginning of this case. There is a direct conflict between two accounts that still hasn't been resolved. According to Nolan's friends, Nolan told them he wanted to stay behind on the island with Katie McCormick. But according to statements attributed to Katie's side through friends, rather than through a direct public interview with her, Nolan told her that he was going back to the boat. Two different versions of the same moment. And right now, there is no clear answer explaining which one is accurate. That leaves us with two very different versions of what Nolan supposedly decided to do that afternoon. Both accounts are describing the same basic moment, the same group of people, and the same decision. But they lead to completely different conclusions about what Nolan intended. According to the friends who were with him, Nolan told them he wanted to remain on Horn Island with Katie McCormick. The explanation is straightforward. He had met her, he wanted to spend more time with her, and he planned to find another way back later. But the version that has been attributed to Katie is different. According to what has been reported from people speaking on her side, Nolan told her that he was going back to the boat. Those two statements cannot both accurately describe Nolan's final decision. And that's exactly why Ben Crump focused so heavily on the contradiction when it first became public. He put it in very direct terms. They're not saying the same thing. One of them is telling the truth. One of them is not. We have to get to the bottom of that. That's really the question sitting at the center of this part of the timeline. Who was Nolan actually planning to leave with? Was he intending to stay on the island with Katie, as his friends have said? Or was he planning to return to the boat, as the account connected to Katie suggests? There is another possibility, of course. People can misunderstand conversations. Someone can hear part of a conversation and interpret it differently. A statement made casually in a loud, crowded environment can later be remembered in a completely different way. Horn Island on the 4th of July was not a quiet place. Boats, music, crowds, and people moving in every direction made communication difficult. So even though the contradiction matters, it doesn't automatically tell us which version is correct. What it does tell us is that one of the most important moments in Nolan's timeline is still disputed. And as far as the public record shows, nobody has completely resolved that dispute. But the pressure surrounding this case has gone well beyond that single disagreement. As the investigation continued, attention surrounding Nolan's disappearance became increasingly intense. And eventually, that attention began producing consequences that had almost nothing to do with what happened on the island itself. The FBI confirmed that it was investigating interstate threats connected to the case. By early August, 3 separate people had been federally charged over alleged threatening communications related to the investigation. The details of those cases are serious. One man from California was accused of sending violent threats toward a sitting judge whose family has a connection to the Nolan Wells case. A woman from Ohio was accused of making bomb threats against 2 Mississippi government offices connected to the investigation. The threats were considered serious enough to result in a building lockdown. And a third man from Illinois was charged over alleged threats directed toward witnesses and members of their families. These aren't simply angry comments posted online and forgotten a few minutes later. These allegations resulted in federal charges, and the potential consequences include substantial prison sentences. Now, it's important to separate these threat cases from the actual investigation into Nolan's death. The fact that someone allegedly threatened a witness, a judge, or a government office does not prove anything about what happened to Nolan. It doesn't establish that any particular theory about his disappearance is correct. What it does show is how intense the public reaction to this case has become. This investigation has attracted enough attention that people connected to it in different ways are now dealing with threats serious enough to bring federal authorities into the picture. That's a remarkable development for a case that began with one young man failing to return home after spending the 4th of July on an island. And the people caught up in that pressure aren't limited to Nolan's immediate family. Witnesses have been affected. Families of people connected to the case have been affected. Even a judge whose family has a connection to the investigation reportedly became the target of threats. That tells you something about the environment surrounding this case right now. There is a huge amount of emotion attached to it. People have formed opinions about what happened, often before all of the available evidence has been made public. Some believe the existing timeline makes sense. Others believe there are too many unanswered questions to accept it at face value. And when those disagreements become intense enough, some people stop discussing the evidence and start attacking the people connected to the case. That's where the situation becomes dangerous. Because Nolan's family is still waiting for answers while the investigation itself remains unresolved. The public still doesn't have a confirmed explanation for what happened during those final hours. There is no publicly established sequence that accounts for every movement, every conversation, and every moment between Nolan's last confirmed appearances and the discovery of his remains. And that uncertainty has created an environment where almost every new piece of information gets examined, debated, and sometimes exaggerated. Which brings us to another piece of information that has received an enormous amount of attention. It's an audio recording from that afternoon. Specifically, the distress call made from the boat during the reported mechanical problem. The original call was already significant because it was connected to the explanation given for why the group decided to leave Horn Island. But an enhanced version of the recording began circulating, and some listeners claimed they could hear something in the background that wasn't obvious in the original audio. That is where Nancy Grace entered the conversation. And what she focused on wasn't simply whether people could hear a phrase. The bigger question was whether the recording itself could be trusted. That question is where the next part of this story begins. The audio became one of those pieces of information that people could not stop discussing, partly because of what some listeners believed they heard and partly because nobody had established exactly what the recording contained. Nancy Grace addressed the enhanced version of the distress call on her program. She focused on a phrase that some listeners believed could be heard in the background, something that sounded similar to, "Wake the F up." Now, that phrase is important to mention carefully because there is a major difference between saying that people believe they hear something and saying that the recording has been officially confirmed to contain those words. Nancy Grace herself did not treat it as settled fact. Instead, she raised a series of questions. Was the audio authentic? Had the recording been altered or enhanced in a way that changed what could be heard? If the voice was actually present in the original recording, who was speaking? And perhaps most importantly, who was that person speaking to? Those questions are still open. As of tonight, there has been no public confirmation from law enforcement that this particular audio has been authenticated. Investigators have not publicly identified the voice. They have not publicly confirmed that the phrase can be heard in the original recording, and they have not publicly stated that the recording was manipulated either. Nobody directly connected to that phone call has publicly provided a definitive answer that settles the issue. So, for now, this audio belongs in a category that is important but limited. It exists. People have listened to it. Some believe they can clearly hear a particular phrase. Other people listen to the same recording and hear something completely different. And until the original audio is professionally examined and the results are made known, neither interpretation should be treated as established evidence. That distinction may sound small, but it matters. Audio can be surprisingly difficult to interpret, especially when a recording contains background noise, multiple voices, engines, wind, music, or people speaking at the same time. Enhancement can make certain sounds easier to hear, but it can also change how our ears perceive what was originally captured. When people already have an idea of what a recording is supposed to contain, they can sometimes hear that expected phrase even when another listener hears something else entirely. That's one reason authentication matters. You don't want the question to be, "What do you think you hear?" You want the question to be, "What can be established from the original recording?" And right now, the public doesn't have that answer. That doesn't mean the audio should simply be ignored. It has already become part of the discussion surrounding Nolan's disappearance, and a significant number of people following the case have heard the enhanced version. Ignoring it would create an incomplete picture. But turning an unverified recording into proof would create a different problem. It would take something that is still uncertain and present it as something that has already been established. Neither approach is fair to the evidence. So the responsible position is somewhere in the middle. The audio should be preserved, examined, and, if possible, authenticated. If the phrase is genuinely present in the original recording, then the next question becomes who said it and what was happening at that moment. If the phrase isn't actually present, then that should be established too, because it would remove another piece of speculation from an already complicated timeline. Until then, we simply don't know. And that same interview raised another question that connects directly to the independent autopsy. Nancy Grace also questioned why certain portions of Nolan's neck and throat tissue had been retained by the state medical examiner instead of being sent with the rest of the remains for the independent examination. At first glance, that might sound like a technical detail. But in a forensic investigation, the neck can be an important area. The structures and soft tissue around the throat can potentially provide information about trauma, pressure, or other injuries to that part of the body. Depending on the circumstances, those findings can be relevant when a pathologist is trying to determine whether a person experienced some type of trauma around the neck. That does not mean Nolan was strangled. It does not mean there was pressure applied to his neck. And it does not establish foul play. It simply explains why the absence of those structures became a question once the independent examination was performed. Dr. Roger Mitchell, the pathologist who conducted the independent examination, has publicly acknowledged that he was not certain why the state medical examiner retained those tissues. But he also made another important point. Keeping tissue samples for additional testing or examination is not automatically unusual when an investigation is still active. Medical examiners may retain specific structures or samples for further analysis when they believe additional work could be necessary. So there are two things we have to keep in mind at the same time. There may be a completely routine explanation for why the tissue was retained. And there is also a legitimate question about why that happened in this particular case and what additional examination, if any, the state intends to conduct. Those 2 points don't cancel each other out. The fact that something can be normal procedure doesn't mean every question surrounding it has been answered. And the fact that the public doesn't have an explanation doesn't mean the decision was improper. Right now, the information available simply doesn't allow us to reach that conclusion. What we can say is that Nolan's independent pathologist did not have access to every part of the neck and throat structures when he conducted his examination. That limitation matters when people try to compare the independent findings with the state's eventual conclusions. It also matters to Nolan's family, because they are the people waiting for an explanation of what happened to their son. Until the state medical examiner's findings become available, there are questions that outsiders simply cannot answer with certainty. Why were those tissues retained? What did the state examination find? Did those findings contribute to the final determination of cause and manner of death? And will the results change how investigators understand Nolan's final hours? Those answers remain unavailable to the public right now. And that brings us to another issue that has surrounded this case almost from the beginning, the question of race and whether Nolan's disappearance received the level of urgency that it should have. That question has been raised publicly by Ben Crump and by Nolan's family, and it has also produced a response from someone who knew Nolan personally. That response is more complicated than simply agreeing or disagreeing. And that's where Jayvon Williams enters the conversation again. Nolan was the only black member of the group of friends he arrived with at Horn Island. That fact has become part of the wider discussion surrounding the investigation, especially because questions have been raised about whether race affected the urgency of the response. Ben Crump has argued publicly that the investigation might have been handled differently if the circumstances had been reversed. His question is simple. What if 3 young black men had returned from the island while their white friend was the one who never came home? Would authorities have moved faster? Would investigators have asked tougher questions? Would the disappearance have received more attention from the beginning? Those are serious questions, but they remain questions. They are not established findings about what investigators did or why they did it. Nolan's parents have expressed similar concerns. They have said they worry that their son's case did not receive the immediate urgency they believe it might have received under different circumstances. For them, this isn't an abstract debate. They're talking about their son, a young man who went to an island with friends and never returned. But there is a difference between believing a case should have been handled differently and proving that race caused investigators to act differently. That distinction matters, especially in a case where so many other details remain unresolved. Then there's Jayvon Williams. When Jayvon was asked directly about the racial question, his answer was more complicated than some people expected. He didn't simply agree that race must have played a role. Instead, he said he wasn't comfortable answering the question that way. Jayvon explained that when he and his friends go to Ocean Springs, having white friends is normal for their group. The racial makeup of the group itself was not something he considered unusual. Jayvon knew Nolan personally and was on Horn Island that same day, although he traveled separately. But his opinion doesn't settle the larger question about race and the investigation. Ben Crump believes the racial dynamic deserves serious scrutiny. Nolan's parents have expressed concern that their son's case may not have received the urgency they expected. Jayvon, however, was more cautious about connecting the investigation directly to race. Those positions can exist at the same time. And that's important because complicated cases are often reduced to 2 simple sides. One side says the investigation has not done enough. The other says there isn't enough evidence to claim that race affected it. Right now, the available information doesn't completely prove either position. What we can say is that the question has been raised publicly and has become part of the discussion surrounding Nolan's disappearance. We can also say that Jayvon's response provides a counterpoint because he did not automatically accept the conclusion some people expected him to accept. That doesn't prove Crump's concerns are wrong. It doesn't prove they're right either. It gives us another first-hand perspective from someone who was close to Nolan. Some disagreements aren't about what happened. They're about how much weight should be given to information that remains incomplete. The fact that Nolan was the only black member of his group is real. Crump's concern is real. His family's concern is real. Jayvon's response is also real. But determining whether race actually influenced the investigation would require evidence about investigative decisions, timing, resources, questioning, and the reasons behind those choices. Without that information, it would be premature to say as fact that race either did or did not affect the investigation. That's why this issue has to be handled carefully. Nolan's family deserves to have their concerns heard without those concerns automatically being treated as proof. At the same time, those concerns shouldn't be dismissed simply because there isn't yet a public finding confirming them. And the same standard should apply to everything else we've discussed. The conflicting accounts about whether Nolan intended to stay or return remain unresolved. The audio some listeners believe contains a voice remains unauthenticated. The reason the state retains certain neck and throat structures has not been fully explained publicly. The medical findings have not produced a conclusion that everyone agrees on. But one line has to remain clear. Questions are not answers. Contradictions are not proof of wrongdoing. An unexplained detail is not automatically evidence of a crime. And an unverified recording doesn't become reliable simply because thousands of people have heard it. Nolan's family is still waiting for answers. The public awaits the medical findings. Investigators still have questions to resolve. Until those answers arrive, the most responsible approach is to resist turning uncertainty into certainty. Jayvon's response doesn't provide a final answer about race, but it reminds us that even people close to Nolan don't necessarily interpret every part of this case the same way. If the goal is to understand what happened to Nolan Wells, every perspective has to be considered, including the ones that don't fit neatly on one side. And until the evidence closes these gaps, the questions remain. It's not out of place. I want you to notice what Jayvon did during that interview, because it may be one of the most important moments in the entire conversation. He didn't validate the theory dominating public discussion, and he didn't dismiss the concerns raised by his community. Instead, he refused to reach a conclusion he couldn't honestly defend. That choice matters because restraint, especially in emotional investigations, often reveals more credibility than confidence ever can. Sometimes the strongest answer is admitting uncertainty while everyone else races toward certainty without enough verified evidence supporting their conclusions at all that day. In my experience working investigations, the witnesses who quietly admit, "I don't know," are usually the ones worth listening to the longest. People naturally want answers, especially when a case captures national attention. But wanting certainty and having certainty are completely different things. Jayvon understood that distinction. He never claimed to know exactly what happened after Nolan disappeared. He simply refused to endorse a conclusion he couldn't personally support. In a world filled with bold theories and viral opinions, that kind of discipline is surprisingly rare. And sometimes, it's exactly what protects an investigation from going in the wrong direction. So let's step back and look at what this case has been building toward from the beginning. For more than a month, one explanation shaped almost every public conversation about Nolan Wells' final hours. The story was simple, consistent, and easy to understand. Nolan chose to stay behind on Horn Island because he wanted to spend more time with Katie McCormick. His friends left without him, believing he would find another ride home later. That version became the foundation for countless interviews, articles, podcasts, and online discussions because it appeared straightforward and came from the people who were reportedly with him during those final moments. It's important to acknowledge something before questioning that account. The three friends who were on the boat have repeated essentially the same version of events across separate interviews. Their timeline has remained remarkably consistent, with very little variation in the core details. Consistency like that deserves to be recognized. It doesn't automatically make a story true, but it also shouldn't be dismissed simply because unanswered questions still exist. Fair investigations require both skepticism and fairness. If witnesses remain consistent over time, that consistency becomes part of the evidence, even if investigators continue testing whether every detail matches the facts. But consistency alone doesn't close a case, especially when another equally credible perspective enters the conversation. This week, the accepted timeline encountered its strongest challenge yet, not from internet speculation or anonymous sources, but from someone who knew Nolan better than almost anyone else. Jayvon Williams wasn't offering a theory based on headlines. He was speaking about years of friendship, shared experiences, and repeated patterns of behavior. His argument wasn't that he witnessed Nolan's final decision. His argument was something much narrower and, in many ways, much more powerful. He simply said the version being repeated didn't sound like Nolan. Then something unexpected happened. Nolan's father, Wells, expressed almost the exact same concern without coordinating his statement with Jayvon. He described teaching Nolan one lesson throughout his life. If you go somewhere with your group, you come back with your group. It wasn't presented as a dramatic slogan. It was a rule Nolan had reportedly heard since childhood and continued hearing even after leaving for college. According to his father, Nolan always answered the same way, "Yes, sir." That lesson became part of how his family understood responsibility, safety, and loyalty whenever he traveled with friends. Now place those two voices beside each other. One belongs to Nolan's lifelong best friend. The other belongs to the man who raised him. They come from different relationships, different experiences, and different generations. Yet both arrive at nearly the same conclusion. Neither claims to know exactly what happened on Horn Island. Neither accuses anyone of lying. Neither says they witnessed the final conversation. What they independently argue is much simpler. The explanation everyone has accepted for weeks doesn't match the Nolan they knew. That distinction is incredibly important because it challenges the story without pretending to solve the mystery. And that's where this investigation begins to change. Instead of asking whether Nolan's friends have been consistent, the better question becomes whether consistency alone is enough when two independent people challenge the underlying assumption behind that story. The contradiction doesn't prove anyone is wrong. It simply means the timeline is no longer as settled as it once appeared. Once that foundation develops even a small crack, every other unanswered detail becomes more significant, including one involving Nolan's phone. That single piece of evidence would soon raise an entirely different set of questions about where it was, who had it, and why its recovery became so complicated that night. The phone is where the timeline becomes even harder to follow. According to the account from Nolan's mother and Jayvon's mother, the search for it that night produced information that didn't line up neatly. One tracking system appeared to place Nolan's phone in one location, while Snapchat showed it somewhere else. Those weren't simply two people remembering the same event differently. Two digital sources appeared to point in different directions while the family searched for the device. Jayvon's mother, Tashima Hans, described being alongside Christine Wells during that search. She was there while Christine was trying to locate her son's phone. According to Tashima, the location information led them to an address where the house was dark. They eventually got the phone, but not immediately. She said roughly 15 minutes passed before it was handed over. That 15-minute period has naturally attracted attention. But the delay itself doesn't prove anything. A stressful situation involving frightened young people can produce confusion very quickly. What makes the moment worth examining is what happened during those 15 minutes. According to Tashima's account, the explanation about who had the phone changed. At first, she was told the phone was inside someone's truck. Then she was told that a girl would be bringing it outside. Those explanations may have resulted from several people relaying information during a confusing situation. But investigators don't normally ignore an inconsistency simply because an innocent explanation is possible. They document it. They ask questions. They establish who knew what, when they knew it, and why the information changed. The 15-minute window remains unresolved. The phone matters because it was one of the few physical objects connected to Nolan's movements after he became separated from his friends. His phone stayed behind even though he was supposedly planning to remain on the island and find another way home. Later, the device became the subject of a separate search involving multiple tracking systems and conflicting location information. Again, none of that proves what happened to Nolan. A phone can move without its owner, and tracking applications can produce inaccurate or delayed locations. For now, those gaps cannot be filled simply by assumptions, online theories, or confidence from people who were not present that night. Then we reach the medical evidence, and this is where the case becomes even more complicated. The Mississippi State Medical Examiner's Office completed its official autopsy in late July. That report exists, and it has been provided to the Jackson County Sheriff's Office. But the findings have not been released publicly. Nolan's parents have also been waiting to learn what the official examination concluded. The state has completed the examination, yet Nolan's family still doesn't have access to the findings. Officials have linked that restriction to the grand jury process and rules governing such cases. So while the official report remains unavailable, Nolan's family commissioned an independent examination. That examination was conducted by Dr. Roger Mitchell. His preliminary findings did not provide a definitive answer either. He listed both the cause and manner of death as undetermined pending further investigation, and he said he could not rule out the possibility that non-accidental factors contributed to or caused Nolan's death. That statement needs to be understood in context. Saying that non-accidental factors cannot be ruled out is not the same as saying that non-accidental factors caused the death. It means the available information was not sufficient for Mitchell to exclude that possibility. And then another forensic expert offered a very different interpretation. Dr. Michael Baden, the former chief medical examiner of New York City, reviewed the independent findings and said the described injury could be consistent with an ordinary accident. He suggested that Nolan could have struck his head against something in the water or another object, and he characterized the injury as superficial and potentially innocent. Baden's opinion shows how experienced forensic pathologists can examine the same findings and reach different conclusions. One says he cannot exclude a non-accidental explanation. The other says the described findings can fit an ordinary accident and do not point toward foul play. Neither opinion resolves the case. That disagreement makes the final state findings important. Until those findings are released and the evidence is considered alongside the independent examination, it is impossible to honestly claim that the medical question has been settled. But the medical disagreement isn't the only problem with the timeline. In early August, the United Cajun Navy released a 22-page report based on information gathered during the search. The organization compiled tips, photographs, videos, GPS information, and witness accounts to reconstruct Nolan's final known movements. The report instead identified a gap. According to the report, the last time Nolan could be independently and reliably placed through verified footage or corroborated witnesses fell within a broad window between approximately 3:23 and 4:27 that afternoon. The frequently repeated 4:31 departure time of the boat was not independently confirmed through GPS data, engine records, or another electronic source. That matters because 4:31 has become one of the most important timestamps in the entire story. Yet the report could not establish that exact departure time as a hard fact. It remained based largely on witness recollections and available footage. And that leaves investigators with a basic problem. Nobody has completely closed the gap between Nolan's last independently verified location and the moment the boat supposedly left without him. That timeline gap becomes even more important when you place it beside everything else that remains unresolved. The United Cajun Navy's report did not identify a person responsible, and it did not claim that Nolan was alive or dead when the boat departed. It simply documented what could and could not be established from the information available to them. Several boats moved around the area that afternoon, but the report could not determine exactly who was aboard during every movement or whether any of those movements were connected to Nolan. The same caution applies to the mechanical problem reported by the friends. The report could not independently establish exactly when the boat began taking on water or what caused the problem. That doesn't mean the mechanical failure didn't happen. It means the available evidence doesn't allow the public to independently verify every part of that explanation. And then there are the federal threat cases. 3 people have already faced federal charges over alleged threats connected to the investigation. Those cases demonstrate how emotionally charged Nolan's disappearance has become, but they do not establish what happened to him. They are separate legal matters developing alongside the death investigation. The same distinction has to be made with the enhanced audio from the distress call. Some listeners believe they hear someone saying, "Wake the F up." Nancy Grace raised questions about whether the recording is authentic and if the voice is genuine, who is being addressed. But no public law enforcement confirmation has established that the phrase is actually present in the original recording. Until that happens, it remains an unverified piece of information, not a confirmed part of Nolan's timeline. So where does that leave us? It leaves us with a case that is not solved and is nowhere close to having every major question answered. There is the disputed account of Nolan's final decision, the conflicting information surrounding his phone, the sealed state autopsy, the different interpretations of the independent findings, and the timeline gap identified by the Cajun Navy report. None of those details individually proves what happened. But together, they explain why the investigation remains open to serious questions. I spent enough years working investigations to know that certainty can become dangerous when it arrives before the evidence does. I don't have the answer to what happened to Nolan Wells, and neither should anyone pretend they do based only on the information currently available. What we do have is a story that has been repeated for weeks, now being challenged by people who knew Nolan extremely well. His best friend says the accepted explanation doesn't fit the person he knew. His father says essentially the same thing. Neither witnessed Nolan's final moments, and neither can tell us exactly what happened. But their concerns create a contradiction that deserves to be investigated, not ignored. Nolan was 18 years old. His family taught him to stay with the people he came with. His closest friend says that pattern held for years. Somewhere between the conflicting accounts, the phone, the medical evidence, and the unanswered timeline gap is the truth. And until investigators close those gaps, the honest answer remains simple: we don't know yet.